If you've ever been to New York City, chances are you've been to see the Statue of Liberty, the shining emerald green symbol of freedom that was once robotically controlled by Bill Murray and an NES controller in Ghostbusters 2. I'm sure there are other more important things about it, but that's the first thing that comes to mind. And the fact that it was turned into a weeping angel in Doctor Who. Over 10,000 tourists per day climbed the 146 spiral steps to inside Lady Liberty's body, and while 240 people per day purchase a special ticket to climb further into Lady Liberty's crown, few have been allowed access to the statue's torch since 1916. The reason I had always been told this is tourists causing damage to the statue, making the arm unsafe. But the actual story as to why the torch is off-limits is much more bizarre, and honestly should be taught in American schools. The damage coming not from overly pushy tourists trying to squeeze as many Instagram likes out of the monument as possible, but rather from one of the first true terrorist attacks in modern American history. An attack perpetrated by this man, Count Johann Heinrich von Bernstorf, German ambassador to the United States and real-life comic book supervillain. More on him later. But first, some backstory. The year was 1916. The place was Black Tom Island. There on a pier stood warehouses, stocked with munitions set to be shipped to Europe to help the Allies in the First World War. America had yet to officially join in the war effort, but our support of the Allies behind the scenes had not gone unnoticed. You see, the year before, the RMS Lusitania had been sunk en route from the US to Great Britain while transporting civilians. This was because the Germans had suspected them of smuggling weapons and ammunition on commercial ships. They were right, of course, but that was still mass slaughter of civilians and only fueled public outcry for the US to join in the war effort. That is how, in this time, in this place, over 1 kiloton of extremely explosive supplies sat open to the summer night's air, long after the drivers had gone home to their families, and there were only a handful of extremely mosquito-bitten guards left on the docks. As luck would unfortunately have it, Black Tom Island was the major shipping point for fuel reserves headed to Europe, and a munitions factory in Manhattan sent their detonator fuses through this shipyard as well. Dynamite shipped from a Pennsylvania manufacturer made its way through these very trucks into these very warehouses and onto these very ships. This would be a dangerous combination in the best of times, and prove to be a lethal mistake when you assume, as many did, that the war that they were unofficially fighting would never come to them. Just after 2 a.m. on July the 30th, 1916, residents in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania were awoken by a loud bang, and no one in the entire state could identify the cause. That is because they were awoken by an explosion over 100 miles away in New York City. Those in New York, however, would be witness to one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in history. Fires lit in the warehouses and on the ships containing the fuel and the ammo alerted the guards to contact the New Jersey Fire Department, but it was far too late. At 2:08 a.m., the first of 2 major blasts would occur, and the fires would rage long into the morning. A lesser but still devastating blast would occur at 2:40, but by then both guards and fire crews had realized abandoning the island was the only course of action. The shockwave felt would have measured somewhere between 5.0 and 5.5 on the Richter scale, if such a thing as the Richter scale had existed back then. Residents were thrown from their beds, deafened and covered in glass, as the night sky flashed brighter than the sun and burned orange long into the morning. Shrapnel dotted the Statue of Liberty, windows shattered as much as 25 miles away. When the smoke had cleared, 7 people were dead. More than 100 railroad cars and 13 warehouses on the island were gone, and at the epicenter of the carnage stood a 375-foot by 175-foot crater. The cost of the devastation in today's money would equal more than $500 billion. The Statue of Liberty closed for some time for repairs, and when they reopened, they did allow tourists into the torch for a short amount of time before changing their minds and deciding it was too dangerous. The aftermath of this incident might explain why it's not more widely known about, taught about in schools, and understood today as one of the first major acts of terror in the United States. You see, while nowadays we understand this to have been an act of terror, it wasn't thought to be that way at the time. It was thought to have been an accident. The guards who were present at the time of the explosion were brought in by the police for questioning. And it came out that that night they had with them small burning oil pots with them called smudge pots that were used as an old form of bug repellent or mosquito repellent. This was to keep the mosquitoes off them in the humid New York summer, which, as someone who lives in Connecticut, I can completely understand. I imagine working on an island in the Hudson River at 2 a.m. in July before the invention of bug spray must have been unbearable. So they had with them these pots that would burn things that mosquitoes didn't like the smell of as the only version of mosquito repellent that existed. And obviously putting these burning oil pots down near highly flammable materials is cause for concern, but the guards that night didn't feel as though they'd done anything they hadn't done 1,000 times before, and the police didn't buy it either. Newspapers, however, ran with this story, and it became the generally understood reason for why the event had occurred, even though police never bought the mosquito repellent explanation for why Black Tom Island happened. Thus, the first major terrorist attack in modern American history was blamed on mosquitoes, and the world forgot. Investigations over the next decade uncovered the fact that German ambassador to the United States, Count Johann Heinrich von Bernstorf, had secretly led dozens of attacks on the country after the US had begun supporting the Allies. One of which was a plan to destroy the Welland Canal, thus cutting off water supply to Niagara Falls and destroying one of the US's most beautiful natural landmarks just to spite us for supporting the Allies in World War I. Which, like, how much more Silver Age comic book supervillain could you possibly get?
It's like, well, if they won't listen to Count Bernstorf, then I'll blow up Niagara Falls! Mwahaha! And I'll get away with it too, because I have diplomatic immunity.
Like, that's really, really how the life of this real human being reads when you're reading about him. But in all seriousness, this is probably the most dangerous human you've never heard about in American history. One of his other failed maniacal villain plots was working with the Bayer pharmaceutical companies to monopolize the supply of the main ingredient of aspirin in the whole world, which at the time was only being manufactured by, of all people, Thomas Edison. And so his plan was buy up and monopolize and make it so that no one else besides German-owned Bayer Pharmaceuticals can get their hands on the main ingredient of aspirin, because Great Britain was using that same key ingredient to manufacture explosives. So when I explain it like that, it does make sense, but out of context you can see how it sounds like a Dr. Doofenshmirtz plot from Phineas and Ferb, where he's like, and now, Perry the Platypus, I will steal all the aspirin in the entire tri-state area! So, you can get why, at a glance, this man's life looks like he's a supervillain in a Saturday morning cartoon. But yeah, in the off chance his evil schemes don't sound like the plot of a Saturday morning cartoon, he is a substantial threat who has successfully carried out several terrorist attacks to impede the US war effort. On the 1st of January 1915, the Roebling wire and cable plant in Trenton, New Jersey was blown up. On the 28th of January of the same year, an American merchant ship carrying wheat to Britain was sunk. Both incidents are thought to have been ordered by Bernstorf. In coordination with spymaster and future German Chancellor Franz von Papen, and carried out by their lackey Werner Horn, the Vanceboro International Bridge was bombed on February 2, 1915. The bridge connected the Canadian province of New Brunswick to Vanceboro, Maine. The explosion failed to do any lasting damage to the bridge and only succeeded in blowing out the windows of a few nearby houses. And for what it's worth, it did seem like Horn did everything in his power to make sure that there were no casualties in his terrorist attack. That night that he chose happened to be a frigid -30 degrees, a time when he was sure there'd be nobody passing by the bridge on foot, and he went back several times to move the suitcase whenever a train came by, making sure that he wasn't actually going to kill anyone with this. He was simply trying to impede the American and Canadians' ability to trade munitions and fuel over country lines. The case of the Halifax explosion is a bit not well understood. It was originally thought to be one of these German terrorist attacks, and it was the single largest explosion in human history until the nuclear bomb was invented. And while it's generally accepted as an accident today, you can understand why people question if the destruction of a ship sent from Canada to Belgium with fuel supplies on it to help in the war effort in 1917 was an act of German sabotage, when now we know all this other stuff was going on. If the Halifax explosion was indeed one of these attacks, then the death toll under Bernstorf skyrockets as 1,700 people died and another 9,000 were injured. However, it is generally considered that that might have really been an accident, so we don't know. And there were several other instances during these attacks where the, yes, terrorists who carried it out did seem to try and minimize casualties, and the Halifax explosion would not have been one of those. I should also mention that Count Bernstorff was implicated in the Hindu-German conspiracy, a plan in which Germans during World War I tried to incite a rebellion in the then British colony of India. This would have made it so that the British Army would have had to split themselves in half to both fight World War I and defend their colonies. And while yes, that certainly qualifies as a scheme, I'm not quite sure if it qualifies as an evil scheme. And of course there was the most successful of Bernstorff's schemes, the Black Tom Island explosion.
Yes, of course. This time, I know I've created something evil enough to warrant your full attention and anger.
An associate of Bernstorff's, Franz von Rintalin, is accused of bombing 36 cargo ships filled with munitions heading for the Allies, costing millions of dollars in damages and untold lives. His weapon of choice was a cigar bomb or a pencil bomb, a then recent invention of German scientist Dr. Walter Scheel. According to the Smithsonian, pencil bombs were cigar-sized charges filled with acids and placed in copper chambers. These acids would ultimately eat their way through the copper and mingle, creating intense, silent flames. If designed and placed properly, a pencil bomb would be timed to detonate days later while the ships and their cargo were still at sea. Acting under the orders of Ambassador Bernstorff and Spy Master von Rintalin, Slavic immigrant Michael Christoph, who would later fight on the American side of World War I, along with Germans Kurt Janke and Lothar Witski, bribed their way into posing as guards on the pier. The charges were set, the perpetrators made their escape, and the rest is, unfortunately, history. You may have heard that Germany was forced to pay out millions of dollars to all the countries that were destroyed by World War I. In fact, the country bankrupted itself trying to pay off this debt, as they simply printed money in order to pay off the millions upon millions of dollars that they were charged when the Allies defeated them. This ravaged the German economy and was a major recruiting tool for the Nazis, as Hitler ran on the platform that he was going to refuse to pay the debt that Germany acquired, having been blamed for the bulk of the damages caused by World War I. So yeah, you could say it had a big impact. A legal entity was set up specifically to sue Germany for their acts of sabotage, which is basically the old-timey word for terrorism, called the Mixed Claims Commission. And the largest single sum of money Germany was forced to pay out was $50 million for the Black Tom Island explosion, which was even more than they were forced to pay for the sinking of the Lusitania. After interest and inflation, Germany ended up paying $95 million for Black Tom Island, which they finished doing in 1975. Kurt Janke led an interesting life after Black Tom Island, almost as interesting as Bernstorff's. He tried to incite Mexico to go to war with the United States. That didn't work. He then tried to incite a race war within the United States. That didn't work out for him either. Later, he unsurprisingly became a Nazi and worked under Deputy Führer Rudolf Hess until he was captured by the Russians in 1945 and executed. Lothar Witski was sentenced to death in 1918 for crimes unrelated to Black Tom Island, as he and Kurt Jahnke had blown up the Mare Naval Island shipyard that same year as Black Tom. They had been busy in the United States with these acts of sabotage at the time. However, the end of the war brought an armistice and a stay of execution, and in 1923 he was fully pardoned and sent back to Germany, where he was decorated with the Iron Cross first and second class, and he later went on to become a member of the Hamburg Parliament. So absolutely no repercussions. Franz von Rintalin, who I could probably do an entire episode on alone, was brought before both the Swiss minister in London and before Scotland Yard. The man was so convincing that, despite his own people hating him so much that they had ratted him out, he was able to talk his way out of it and be let go. And by his own people, I'm talking about Franz von Papen, the guy who would later be Chancellor of Germany.
Welcome to WatchMojo.com, and today we'll be counting down our picks for the top 10 anime betrayals.
Also responsible for several of these terror attacks in the United States. A lot of big characters caught up in this whole thing. Right, so after being turned in because fellow spy master Franz von Papen didn't like him, Franz von Rintalin was sentenced to prison in Georgia because the Americans were not as easily convinced as Scotland Yard. And he spent 3 years in prison in Georgia before, just like Lothar Witski, being released at the end of the war, as I guess the World War I armistice meant we just released all the prisoners who had committed acts of terror within the United States, and pardoned them and forgave them and shipped them back to Germany like nothing had happened. He later moved to England. Nothing major happened for the rest of his life. I wonder if anyone in England knew that he is responsible for the bombing of 36 ships that certainly had many English citizens on them at the time, but seeing as nothing else seems to be written about the latter half of his life, I don't think he was ever found or understood to be a major terrorist, and he just kind of lived out the rest of his life in secret. So again, no repercussions. As for Bernstorf, well, if his time as ambassador to the United States and terrorist wasn't enough, he then became German ambassador to the Ottoman Empire. And to his credit, he seems to be strongly against the Ottoman Empire's genocide of the Armenian people. In fact, for the rest of his life, you can kind of see him turn into a genuinely good diplomat.
You're probably wondering why I suddenly decided to quit evil and become a good guy.
I don't want to really give him any credit at all, but, I just kind of have to report his life as it was accurately. And from here on in, he seems to have turned over a new leaf. Or maybe it was just America that he hated. Of course, because of World War I, the Ottoman Empire would not exist for long, and so he went on to found the German Democratic Party. He was a member of Germany's parliament from 1921 to 1928, and then he was the first president of the German Association for the League of Nations, president of the World Federation of Association of the League of Nations, and a member of every German delegation to the League of Nations. Quite shockingly, Adolf Hitler referred to him as having the guilt and responsibility of the downfall of Germany. And if Hitler thinks that you are responsible for everything bad in the world, then you're living your life the right way. Count Johann Heinrich von Bernstorf fled Germany in 1933 when Hitler rose to power and destroyed everything he had tried to build for his country since the end of the First World War. He moved to Geneva, Switzerland with his wife and 2 kids, and he died on October 6, 1939 at the age of 76. I have to keep reminding myself that he is indeed a terrorist, probably because he took such a hard stance against two genocides that were happening around him, and all of the seemingly decent things he did for Germany in the latter half of his life, and also because I just picture Dr. Doofenshmirtz's face and voice whenever I think of the man. Today, the land that was once a part of Black Tom Island has been fully connected to mainland New Jersey and incorporated within Lincoln Park. No. Yes, Black Tom Island is a part of Lincoln Park. Today, the land that was once Black Tom Island has been fully connected to mainland New Jersey due to man-made land filling in the Hudson River and has been incorporated into Liberty Park. A tragic end, really, spending the rest of eternity as a part of New Jersey. No evidence of what once occurred there remains, but a plaque commemorating the act of terror long forgotten is passed by thousands of people every day. Thank you for making it to the end of the video with me. If you've stayed this long, please comment down below any topics you'd like me to cover in the future, and let me know how I can improve these videos. I'm really hoping these videos can find an audience, and any suggestions you have would be greatly appreciated. And while you're here, please like the video and subscribe to my channel.